The Dark, by Leonid Andreyev, translated by L.A. Magnus. As a rule, success had accompanied him in all his undertakings, but during the last 3 days complications had arisen which were unfavorable, not to say critical. His life, though a short one, had long been a game of terrible hazards. He was accustomed to these sudden turns of chance, and could deal with them. The stake had before been life itself, his own and others, and this by itself had taught him alertness, swiftness of thought, and a cold, hard outlook. Chance this time had turned dangerously against him. A mere fluke, one of those unforeseeable accidents, had provided the police with a clue. For 2 whole days the detectives had been on his track, a known terrorist and nihilist, drawing the net ever closer round him. One after another the conspirators' hiding places had been cut off from him. There still remained to him a few streets and boulevards and restaurants where he might go undiscovered. But his terrible exhaustion after 2 sleepless nights and days of ceaseless vigilance had brought in its train a new danger. He might drop off to sleep anywhere, on a seat in the boulevards, even in a cab, and be ludicrously arrested as a common drunk. It was now Tuesday. On Thursday, only 1 day to spare, he had to carry out a terrorist act of great importance. The preparations for the assassination had kept the little organization busy for some considerable time. The honor of throwing the last and decisive bomb had fallen to him. He must retain self-command at all costs. But sleep. It was thus, on that October evening, standing at the crossing of crowded streets, that he decided to take refuge in a brothel. He would have had recourse earlier to this refuge, though none too secure, had it not been for the good reason that all his 26 years he had been chaste, had never known women as mere women, had never been in a brothel. Now and then he had had to fight sternly against such desires, but gradually restraint had become habit, and had produced in him an attitude of calmness and complete indifference towards the sex. So now, at the thought of being forced into close contact with a woman who traded in such pleasures, and of perhaps seeing her naked, he had forebodings of any number of unpleasantnesses and awkward moments. True, he had only decided to go to a prostitute now, when his passion was quiescent, when a step had to be taken so important and serious that virginity and the struggle for it lost their value. But in any event it was unpleasant, as might be any other obnoxious incident which must be endured. Once, when assisting in an important act, in which he played the part of second bomb-thrower, he saw a horse which had been killed with its hind parts burst open and the entrails exposed. This incident, its filthy and disgusting character, and its needlessness, gave him a similar sensation, in its way even more unpleasant than the death of a comrade from an exploding bomb. And the more quietly and fearlessly and even joyously he anticipated Thursday, when he would probably have to die, the more was he oppressed with the prospect of a night with a woman who practiced love as a profession, a thing utterly ridiculous, an incarnation of chaos, senseless, petty, and dirty. But there was no alternative. He was tottering with fatigue. It was still early when he arrived, about 10 o'clock, but the great white hall with its gilded chairs and mirrors was ready for the reception of guests, and all the fires were lighted. The pianist was sitting beside the piano, a dapper young man in a black frock coat, for it was an expensive house. He was smoking, carefully flicking the ash of his cigarette so as not to soil the carpet, and glancing over the music. In the corner near the darkened dining-room there sat all a row, on 3 chairs, 3 girls whispering to one another. As he entered with the manageress, 2 of the girls rose, but the third remained sitting. The 2 who rose were very décolleté. The third wore a deep black frock. The 2 looked at him straight, with a look of invitation, half indifferent, half weary, but the third turned aside. Her profile was calm and simple, like that of any proper young maiden, a thoughtful face. Apparently she had been telling a story to the others, and the others had been listening, and now she was continuing the train of thought, telling the rest in silence. And just because she was silent and reflective and did not look at him, because she had the appearance of a proper woman, he chose her. Never before, having been to a brothel, he did not know that in every well-equipped house of this sort there are one or two such women, dressed in black like nuns or young widows, with pale faces, unrouged, even stern, their task being to provide an illusion of propriety to those who seek it. But when they go with a man to their room, drinking and becoming like the rest, or even worse, brawling and breaking the china, dancing about, undressing and dancing into the hall naked, and even killing men who are too importunate. Such are the women with whom drunken students fall in love, whom they persuade to begin new, honorable lives. But of all this he knew nothing. And when she rose reluctantly, and looked at him with displeased and averted eyes, glancing at him sharply out of her pale and colorless face, he thought once again, "How very proper she is," and felt some relief. But, keeping up the dissimulation, constant, unavoidable, which caused him to have two lives and made his life a stage, he balanced himself elegantly on his feet from his heels to his toes, snapped his fingers, and said to the girl with the careless air of a habitual debauchee, "Well, what about it, my dear? Shall we pay you a visit now, eh? Where is your little nest?" "Now? At once?" the girl asked, surprised, and raising her eyebrows. He smiled gaily, disclosing even rows of strong, straight teeth, blushed deeply, and replied, "Certainly. Why lose valuable time?" "There will be some music soon. We can dance." "Dance, my fair charmer? Silly twiddles, catching oneself by the tail. As to the music, it can be heard from up there?" She looked at him and smiled. "Fairly well." She was beginning to like him. He had prominent cheekbones and was clean-shaven. His cheeks and the lower part of the mouth, under the clean-cut lips, were slightly blue, as when dark-bearded men shave. He had fine dark eyes, although in expression a little too unswerving, and they moved slowly and heavily, as though every movement were a great distance to be traversed. But despite his shaven face and easy manner, she reasoned, he did not resemble an actor, but rather an acclimatized foreigner. "You are not a German?" she asked. "No, not quite. I mean, I'm an Englishman. Do you like Englishmen?" "But what good Russian you speak! I should never have guessed." He recollected his British passport and the affected accent he had been using lately. And he blushed again at the thought of having forgotten to keep up the pretense as he ought to have done. Then, with a slight frown, and assuming a businesslike dryness of tone in which a certain amount of weariness was perceptible, he took the girl by the elbow and led her along swiftly. "No, I am a Russian. Now, where are we to go? Show me. This way?" The large mirror showed the full-length figures of the pair sharply and clearly, she in black, pale, and at that distance very pretty. He also in black, and just as pale. Under the glare of the electric lights hanging from the ceiling, his wide forehead and the hard mass of his prominent cheeks were peculiarly pale. And both in his face and the girl's, where the eyes should have been, there were mysterious, fascinating hollows. And so strange was the picture of such a black, stern couple against the white walls, reflected in the broad gilded mirror, that he was startled, and stopped short by the thought, "Like a bride and bridegroom." And, as his imagination was dulled by want of sleep, and his thoughts brusque and inconsequent, the next moment, looking at the stern pair in mourning black, he thought, "As at a funeral." And both notions were equally unpleasant. Apparently his feelings were shared by the girl. She silently, wonderingly glanced at herself and him and herself. She tried to wink, but the mirror would not respond to so slight a movement, and in the same dull and obstinate manner persisted in picturing this black shamefast couple. And perhaps this pleased the girl, or recalled something of herself, something sad, for she smiled gently and lightly pressed his clenched hand. "What a couple!" she said reflectively, and for some reason or other the dark bow of her eyelashes with the fine curve of their droop became more noticeable. This he did not observe, but resolutely dragged the girl along with him, she tapping her way on high French heels on the parquet flooring. There was a corridor, as there always is, and narrow dark little rooms with open doors. At one of them, inscribed above in irregular handwriting, "Liuba." They entered. "And now, Liuba," he said, looking round and unconsciously rubbing his hands one over the other, as though carefully washing them in cold water, "don't we want wine and something else? Or some fruit?" "Fruit is expensive here." "That doesn't matter. Do you drink wine?" He had forgotten himself, and was addressing her as you. He noticed it, but did not correct himself, for there had been something in that touch of her hand which made him unwilling to use the familiar pronoun, or play the lover and act a part. This feeling, too, passed on to her. She stared at him fixedly, and answered deliberately, with some uncertainty in her voice, though none in the language she used. "Thank you, I do drink. Wait a moment, I will return at once. I will tell them to bring only 2 pears and 2 apples. Will that be enough?" It was now she who was using the pronoun of politeness, and through the tone of voice in which she spoke the word there could be heard the same irresolution, a slight hesitation and interrogation. But he paid no attention to this. When he was alone, he went swiftly to work surveying the room from all sides. He tested the closing of the door. It closed splendidly, on the latch and on the key. Went to the window, opened both casements. It was high up on the 2nd floor, and looked out on the courtyard. He frowned and shook his head. Then he experimented on the lights. There were 2 of them. When the one on the ceiling was switched off, the other by the bed lit up under a little red hood, just as in the best hotels. But the bed! He grinned and raised his shoulders, as though laughing silently, distorting his face, as people must who are stealthy and for some reason secretive, even when they are alone. But the bed! He walked round it, handled the wadded counterpane, and then, with a sudden longing to be gay and saucy in his joy at the sleep he was going to have, he twisted his head like a boy, stuck out his lips, made round eyes, all to express his highest degree of amazement. But at once he became serious again, sat down, and wearily waited for Liuba. He wanted to think of Thursday, that he was now in a brothel, that he was already there, but the thought rebelled and stubbornly resisted him. Outraged sleep was taking its revenge. There on the street, sleep had been so gentle. Now it no longer caressed his face, as with a soft downy hand, but made his own hands and feet writhe, and racked his body, as though it would rend him asunder. Suddenly he began yawning, even to the point of tears. He took out his Browning and 3 full clips of cartridges, and savagely blew down the barrel, as into a key. It was all in order, and he longed insufferably for sleep. When the wine and fruit were brought in, and Liuba came in after them, he shut the door, only on the latch, and said, "Well, all right. Please help yourself, Liuba, please do." "And you?" The girl, surprised, looked at him askance. "I will, later on. For 2 nights, you see, I have been having a gay time of it, and have had no sleep, and now—" He yawned frightfully, straining his jaws. "Well, I will, later. Just an hour. I will, soon. And you, please drink and don't spare. And eat the fruit. Why did you get so little?" "But may I go into the hall? There will be some music." This was inconvenient. They might begin talking about him, the strange guest who had gone to sleep, and might start guessing, and that might be awkward. So, lightly restraining a yawn which was already riving his jaws, he said sedately and earnestly, "No, Liuba, I shall ask you to stay here. You see, I don't much like sleeping alone in a room. It's a mere whim, but you will excuse me." "Certainly. You have paid your money, and—" "Yes, yes," and he blushed for the 3rd time. "Quite true, but that isn't what I mean. And if you like, you can lie down, too. I will leave room for you. Only please lie next to the wall. You don't mind?" "No, I don't want to sleep. I will just sit here." "Will you read?" "There are no books here." "Would you like today's paper? I have it here. There is something interesting in it." "No, thank you." "As you like. You know best. But, with your permission—" He shut and locked the door, and put the key in his pocket, without noticing the strange look with which the girl followed his movements. This courteous and decent conversation, such a curious conversation in this home of misery, where the very air was thick with the vapors of drunken brawls, seemed to him perfectly natural and quite convincing. With the same polite air, as though he were in the company of young ladies, he touched the edge of his frock coat and asked, "Do you mind if I take off my coat?" The girl scowled slightly. "Certainly, of course." "And my waistcoat? It's so tight." The girl did not answer, but merely shrugged her shoulders. "Here is my pocket-book, and money. Will you be so good as to take care of them for me?" "You had better leave them at the office. We always deposit such things there." "Why?" He looked at the girl and turned aside in confusion. "Oh, of course. But that's silly." "But do you know how much you have on you? Some people don't know, and then afterwards—" "I understand. Quite. You desire—" He lay down, politely leaving room for her by the wall. An enchanting sleep, spaciously smiling, came and nestled with its downy cheek against his, gently fondled him, stroking his knees, and mercifully settling to rest with its soft, velvety head on his shoulder. He smiled. "What makes you smile?" The girl smiled involuntarily. "Because I am comfortable. How soft your pillows are! Now we can talk a while. Why don't you drink something?" "I think I shall take off my things, if you don't mind. I shall have to sit still so long." Her voice had a touch of mockery, but at the sight of his unsuspecting glance, and hearing his simple "Certainly, please do," she explained quite simply and seriously, "My corset is so tight. I shall take it off too, if I may." "Certainly you may." He turned away, blushing. But either because insomnia had so addled his thoughts, or because all his life he had been so innocent, his "you may" sounded quite natural to him, in a house where all things were allowed and nobody ever thought of asking anybody's leave about anything. He heard a rustling of silk and the unbuttoning of a dress. Then a question. "You are not an author?" "What, an author? No, I am not an author. Do you like authors?" "No, I do not." "Why? They are men?" He yawned, a long, satisfying yawn. "And what is your name?" Silence, and then, "My name is no, Peter." "And what are you? What do you do?" The girl questioned him gently but watchfully, and in a firm tone. The impression conveyed by her voice might have been that she was moving towards the bed. But he by now had ceased to hear her. He was already sleeping. For one moment an expiring thought had flickered in a single picture, in which time and space melted into a motley of shadows, gloom and light, motion and repose, a single picture of crowds and endless streets, and a ceaseless turning of wheels depicted the whole of those 2 days and nights of frenzied chase. And in an instant all of this was stilled, dimmed, and had passed away, and then, in the soft half-light, in the deep shadow, he had an image of one of the picture galleries where, the night before, for 2 hours, he had eluded his pursuers. He seemed to be sitting on a red velvet divan, which was extraordinarily soft, and staring fixedly at a huge black picture. And such a restfulness proceeded from that old black cracked canvas, his eyes were so much rested, his thoughts reposing so gently, that for some moments, even in his sleep, he began fighting sleep, confusedly afraid of it, as though of an unknown disquietude. But the music in the hall played on, the frequent little notes with bare heads, hairless jostled up and down, and the thought came, "Now I can sleep." And all at once he fell into a deep slumber. Triumphantly, eagerly, gentle glossy sleep soothed and embraced him, and in profound silence, masking their breathing, they went their way into a pellucid melting sea. Thus he slept on, 1 hour and then another, on his back in the polite posture he had assumed awake, his right hand in his pocket holding the key and his revolver. The girl, neck and arms bare sitting opposite, smoking, sipping cognac, gazing on him. Now and then, to get a better view, she craned her rather thin, flexible neck, and, when she moved, her lips curled with 2 deep creases of constraint. She had not thought to turn out the hanging lamp, and under the strong light he was neither young nor old, nor strange nor intimate, but some unknown being, the cheeks unknown, the nose ending in a bird's beak of shape unknown, the breathing, so even and powerful and strong, unknown. His thick hair was cut short in military fashion, and she noticed on the left temple, near the eye, a little whitened scar from some former wound. There was no cross strung round his neck. The music in the hall died down or started afresh, piano and violin and songs and the pit-a-pat of dancing feet. But she sat on, smoking cigarettes and observing the sleeper. She stretched her neck inquisitively to look at his left hand, which was lying on his breast, a very broad palm and strong restful fingers. It seemed to weigh heavily on him, to hurt, so with a careful movement she lifted it and let it down gently at the side of the big body on the bed, then rose swiftly and noisily, and, as though she wanted to smash the switch, roughly turned out the upper lamp, lighting the lower one under the red hood. But even then he did not stir. His face in the pink light remained as unknown, as terrifying as before, in its immobility and repose. She turned aside, clasped her knees with her arms, now softly reddening, threw her head back and stared motionless at the ceiling from the dusky hollows of her unblinking eyes, and in her teeth, tightly pressed, there hung a cigarette, half-smoked, cold, dead. Something had happened, something unexpected and terrible, something considerable and of consequence, while he was sleeping. This much he understood at a flash, even before he was properly awake, at the first sound of a harsh, unknown voice. He took it in with that sharpened sense of danger which to him and his comrades had developed almost into a new special sense. He was up quickly, and sat with his hand pressing his revolver hard, his eyes searchingly and sharply exploring the mist of the room. And when he saw her, in the same attitude, with her shoulders of that transparent rosy hue, and her bared breast, and those eyes so enigmatically dark and unswerving, he thought to himself, "She has betrayed me." Then he looked again more steadily, sighed deeply, and corrected himself. "She hasn't yet, but she will." How miserable it all was! He drew a deep breath and asked curtly, "Well, what is it?" She said nothing. She smiled triumphantly and spitefully, and looked at him and was silent, as though she already accounted him her own, and without haste or hurry wanted to gloat over her power. "What did you say just now?" he repeated, with a frown. "What I said? I said, get up. That's what I said. Get up. You've been asleep. It's time to play the game. This isn't a doss-house, my dear." "Turn on the light," he commanded. "I will not." He turned it on himself, and under the white light he saw her eyes infinitely wicked and black and painted, and her mouth compressed with hatred and disdain. And he saw the naked arms, and all of her, alien, decisive, ready to do something irrevocable. He saw the prostitute, a creature repellent to him. "What's the matter with you? Are you drunk?" he asked, seriously disquieted, and put out a hand to take his high-starched collar. But, anticipating his movement, she snatched at the collar, and without looking hurled it somewhere, anywhere, into the room, behind the chest of drawers, into a corner. "I won't give it to you." "What are you after now?" he asked calmly enough, but gripping her arm with a hard firm pressure all around like an iron ring, so that the fingers of her thin hand drooped powerlessly. "Let go! You're hurting me!" she cried, and he held her more gently, but did not release his hold. "You! Look for it!" "What is it, my dear? Are you going to shoot me? Isn't that a revolver you have in your pocket? Well, shoot! Shoot! I'll see how you shoot me. Or would you like to tell me why you take a woman and then go to sleep by yourself and tell her to drink, drink, and I'll go to sleep, with his hair cut and clean shaven, so that he thinks nobody will know him? Do you want to go to the police, my dear? To the police? Eh?" She laughed loud and merrily, and in a way that really frightened him. There was such a savage, despairing joy on her face, as though she had gone mad. And then the idea that all was going to be lost in such a ludicrous fashion, that he would have to commit this silly, cruel and senseless murder, and yet himself probably perish in vain, struck him with even greater horror. Deadly pale, but extremely calm, and with the same resolute air, he looked at her, followed her every movement and word, collecting his thoughts. "Well, silent now? Lost your tongue?" He could seize this snaky neck and crush it, and she would never be able to utter a shriek. He could do it without compunction. Actually, while he held her so firmly, she had been twisting herself about like a snake. "So you know, Liuba, what I am?" "I do. You—" She enunciated the words syllable by syllable, harshly and with an air of triumph. "You are a revolutionary. That's what you are." "How do you know?" She smiled mockingly. "We aren't quite in the backwoods here." "Well, suppose we admit that I—" "Pooh! Suppose we admit. Let go of my arm. You're all alike, you men, always ready to use your strength against a woman. Let go!" He released her arm and sat down, looking at her with a heavy and obstinate wonder. Something was moving about his cheekbones, a little ball of muscle, with a disturbed motion. But his expression was tranquil, serious, somewhat melancholy, and this made him again seem strange and unknown to her, and also very handsome. "Well, will you know me again?" she exclaimed, and surprised herself by adding a coarse reproof. He raised his brows in surprise, and spoke to her calmly, but without averting his eyes, dully, remotely, as from a distance. "Listen, Liuba. Certainly you can betray me, not only you, but anyone in this house, or in the street. One shout, 'Halt! Arrest him!' and men will come in their tens and hundreds and try to get me, or kill me. And for what reason? Merely because I have done no harm, merely because I have devoted all my life to these very people. Do you understand what it means to sacrifice one's life?" "No, I do not," the girl retorted harshly, but listening attentively. "Some do it out of stupidity, some for spite. Because, Liuba, a common man cannot endure a fine man, and the wicked do not love the good." "What should they love them for?" "Don't think, Liuba, that I am simply praising myself. But just look what my life has been, what it is. From the age of 14 I have been rubbing along in prisons, expelled from school, expelled from home. My parents drove me out. Once I was nearly shot dead, saved only by a miracle. Try to picture it, all one's life passed in this way, all for the sake of others. And for oneself, nothing. Yes, nothing." "And what induced you to be so fine?" she asked jeeringly. But he replied seriously. "I don't know. I must have been born so." "And I was born such a common sort of thing, and yet I came into the world the same way you did, didn't I?" But he was not listening. All his mind was held by the vision of his own past, so unexpectedly, so simply heroic, called up by his own words. "Yes, think of it. I'm 26 years old, and there are already gray hairs on my head, and yet until today—" He hesitated a moment, and went on firmly, proudly. "Up to now I have never known a woman. Never. Do you understand? You are the first I even see. Like that. And to tell the truth, I am just a little ashamed to be looking at your bare arms." The music rose again, wildly, and the floor vibrated with the rhythm of dancing feet, broken by a drunken man's wild whoop, as though he were heading off a herd of stampeding horses. But in the room it was still, and the tobacco smoke rose serenely and melted into a ruddy mist. "That is what my life has been, Liuba." He looked down, thoughtfully and sternly, overcome by the thought of a life so pure, so painfully beautiful, and she made no reply. Then she got up and threw a wrap around her bare shoulders, but at the sight of his look of astonishment, almost gratitude, she smiled and brusquely threw the wrap off, and so arranged her chemise that one breast, rosy and soft, was left bared. He turned away and slightly shrugged his shoulders. "Take a drink," she said. "No, I never drink anything." "What, never drink? But you see, I do." "If you've got some cigarettes, I'll have one." "They're very common ones." "I don't care." And when he took the cigarette, He noticed with pleasure that Liuba had put her chemise straight, and the hope that everything might yet go smoothly rose again. He was a poor smoker, he did not inhale, and womanlike held the cigarette between two straight fingers. "You don't even know how to smoke!" the girl exclaimed angrily, and roughly tried to snatch the cigarette from him. "Throw it away!" "Now, there you are, angry with me again." "Yes, I am." "But why, Liuba? Just think. For 2 nights I haven't had any sleep, running about the town from pillar to post, and now you're going to give me up, and they'll have me in jail. That's a fine finish, isn't it? But, Liuba, I'll never give in alive." He stopped short. "Will you shoot?" "Yes, I shall shoot." The music had ceased for a time, but the wild drunken man was still hallooing, although apparently someone, as a joke or in earnest, had a hand on his mouth, the sounds coming through the compressed fingers even more desperately and savagely. The room reeked no longer with cheap fragrant soap, but with a thick, moist, and repulsive odor. On one wall, uncovered, there hung messily and flat some petticoats and blouses. It was all so repugnant, so strange, to think that this also was life, that people were living such a life day in, day out, that he felt dazed and shrugged his shoulders and again looked round slowly. "What a place this is!" he said, bemused, and resting his eyes on Liuba. "What of it?" she asked curtly. He looked at her as she stood there, and suddenly understood that she was to be pitied. And as soon as he had grasped this, he did pity her, ardently. "You are poor, Liuba?" "Well?" "Give me your hand." And, as though to assert in some way his relation to the girl as a human being, he took her hand and respectfully raised it to his lips. "You mean that for me?" "Yes, Liuba, for you." Then, quite quietly, as though thanking him, she said, "Off you go! Get out of here, you blockhead!" He did not understand at once. "What?" "Off with you! Get out of here! Get out!" Silently, with a steady step, she crossed the room, picked up the white collar in the corner, and threw it to him with an expression of disgust, as though it had been the dirtiest, filthiest rag. And he, likewise silent, but with an expression of high resolve, without sparing even one glance at the girl, began quietly and slowly buttoning on the collar. But all in a moment, with a savage whine, Liuba struck him on his shaven cheek with all her strength. The collar fell on the floor. He was shaken from his balance, but steadied himself. Pale, almost blue, but still silent, with the same look of lofty composure and proud incomprehension, he faced her with a stolid, unswerving stare. She was drawing rapid breaths and staring at him in terror. "Well?" she gasped. He looked at her, still silent. Then, maddened beyond endurance by his haughty unresponsiveness, terror-stricken by the stone wall against which she seemed to have flung herself, the girl lost all control of herself, and seizing him by the shoulders, forcibly thrust him down upon the bed. She bent over him, her face near his, and eye to eye. "Well, why don't you answer? What are you trying to do with me? You scoundrel, that's what you are. Kiss my hand, will you? Come here to boast of yourself, will you? To show off your beauty? What are you trying to do with me? Do you think I'm so happy?" She shook him by the shoulders, and her thin fingers, unconsciously curling and uncurling like a cat's claws, scratched his body through his shirt. "And he's never known a woman, hasn't he? You brute, you dare come here and brag about this to me for whom any man is simply... Where's your decency? What do you think you're doing with me? I'll never give in alive. That's the tune, is it? But of course, I'm already dead. You understand, you rascal? I'm dead, but I spit in your face. In the face of the living. There! Get out, you brute! Get out of here!" With anger he could no longer command, he threw her off him, and she fell backwards against the wall. Apparently his mind was still confused, for his next movement, equally rapid and decisive, was to seize his revolver and look at its grinning, toothless mouth. But the girl never so much as saw his bespattered face, damp and disfigured with demoniac rage, nor the black revolver. She covered her eyes with her hands, as though to crush them into the farthest recesses of her brain, stepped forward swiftly and steadily, and flung herself on the bed, face down, in a fit of silent sobbing. Everything had turned out different from what he had anticipated. Out of vapidity and nonsense there had crept forth a chaos, savage, drunken, and hysterical, with a crumpled, distorted face. He shrugged his shoulders, put away the useless revolver, and began pacing the room up and down. The girl was crying. To and fro again. The girl was crying. He stopped beside her, his hands in his pockets, to look at her. There, under his eyes, face down, lay a woman, sobbing frantically in an agony of unbearable sorrow, sobbing as one who looks suddenly back on a wasted life or a better life irretrievably lost. Her naked, fine, tapering shoulder blades were heaving as though to heap fuel on the raging furnace within, and sinking as though to compress the tense anguish in her bosom. The music had started afresh, a mazurka now, and the jingle of spurs could be heard. Some officers must have come. Such tears he had never seen. He was disconcerted. He took his hands out of his pockets and said gently, "Liuba." Still she sobbed. "Liuba, what is the matter, Liuba?" She answered, but so faintly that he could not hear. He sat by her on the bed, bent his shorn head, and laid a hand on her shoulders, and his hand responded with a quiver to the trembling of those pitiable shoulders. "I can't hear what you say, Liuba." Then something distant, dull, soaked in tears. "Wait, before you go, over there. Some officers have arrived. They might see you. My God, to think—" She sat up quickly on the bed, clasping her hands, eyes wide open, staring into space in sudden fear. The terror lasted a moment, and then she again lay down and wept. Outside the spurs were jingling rhythmically, and the pianist, with revived energy, was conscientiously beating out a vigorous mazurka. "Take a drink of water, Liuba. Do. You really must. Please," he whispered as he bent over her. Her ear was covered with her hair, and, fearing that she could not hear, he carefully brushed aside those dark curling locks, and discovered a hot little red shell of an ear. "Please drink. I beg you." "No, I don't want a drink. There's no need. It's all over." She had quieted down by now. The sobbing stopped, one more long throe, and the shuddering shoulders were pathetically still. He was gently stroking her neck down to the lace of the chemise. "Are you better, Liuba?" She said nothing, but heaved a long sigh and turned around, quickly glancing at him. Then she relaxed and sat up, looked up at him again, and rubbed his face and eyes with the plaits of her hair. She breathed another long sigh, and quite gently and simply laid her head on his shoulder, and he as simply put an arm round her and drew her silently close to him. Her fingers touched her naked shoulder, but this no longer disturbed him. And thus they sat a long while without speaking, but with now and then a sigh, staring straight ahead of them into space with unseeing eyes. Suddenly there was a sound of voices and steps in the corridor, a jingling of spurs, quite gentle and elegant, like that of young officers. The sound came nearer and halted at the door. He rose promptly. Someone was knocking at the door, first tapping with knuckles and then banging with their fists, and a woman's voice called out, "Liubka, open the door!" He looked at her and waited. "Give me a handkerchief," she said without looking at him, and put her hand out. She rubbed her face hard, blew her nose noisily, threw the handkerchief on his knees, and went to the door. He watched and waited. On her way to the door she turned out the light, and it was all at once so dark that he could hear his own rather labored breathing, and for some reason he sat down again on the creaking bed. "Well, what is it? What do you want?" she asked through the door, without opening it, her voice calm, but still betraying some uneasiness. Feminine voices were heard in argument, and, cutting through them as scissors cut through a tangle of silk, a male voice, young, persuasive, seeming to proceed from behind strong white teeth and a soft mustache. Spurs jingled as though the speaker were responding with a bow, and, strange, Liuba smiled. "No, no, I don't want to come." "Very well, do as you like." "No, not for all your lovely Liubas. I won't come." Another knock at the door, laughter, a sound of scolding, more jingling of spurs, and it all moved away from the door, and died out somewhere down the corridor. In the dark, fumbling for his knee with her hand, Liuba sat down by him, but did not lay her head on his shoulder. She explained briefly, "The officers are starting a dance. They are summoning everybody. They are going to have a cotillion." "Liuba," he said pleadingly, "please turn on the light. Don't be angry." She got up without a word and switched it on. And now she no longer sat with him, but, as before, on the chair facing the bed. Her face was surly, uninviting, but courteous, like that of a hostess who cannot help sitting through an uninvited and overlong visit. "You're not angry with me, Liuba?" "No. Why should I be?" "I wondered just now why you laughed so merrily." She laughed without looking up. "When I feel merry, I laugh. But you can't leave just now. You'll have to wait until the officers get away. It won't be long." "Very well, I will wait. Thank you, Liuba." She laughed again. "How courteous you are." "Don't you like it?" "Not too well. What are you by birth?" "My father is a doctor in the military service. My grandfather was a peasant. We are old ritualists." Liuba, surprised, looked up at him. "Really? But you don't wear a cross round your neck." "A cross!" he laughed. "We wear our cross on our backs." The girl frowned slightly. "You want to go to sleep? You'd better lie down than waste time in this way." "No, I won't lie down. I don't want to sleep any more." "As you wish." There was a long and awkward silence. Liuba gazed downwards and fixed her attention on turning a ring on her finger. He looked round the room. Each time he conspicuously avoided meeting the girl's glance, and rested his eyes on the unfinished glass of cognac. Then, all at once, it became overwhelmingly clear to him, even palpably evident, that all this was no longer what it seemed. That little yellow glass with the cognac, the girl so absorbed in twiddling her ring, and he himself, too. He was no longer himself, but someone else, someone alien and quite apart. Just then the music stopped, and there followed a quiet jingle of spurs. He seemed to himself to have lived at some time, not in this house, but in a place very much like it, and that he had been an active and even important person to whom something was now happening. That strange feeling was so powerful that he shuddered and shook his head, and the feeling soon left him, but not altogether. There remained some faint inexpugnable trace of the turbulent memories of that which had never been, and quite often, in the course of this unusual night, he caught himself at a point whence he was looking down on some object or person, trying anxiously to recall them out of the deep darkness of the past, even out of what had never existed. Had he not known it for a thing impossible, he would have said that he had already been here on some occasion, so familiar and habitual had it all become. And this was unpleasant. It had already imperceptibly estranged him from himself and his comrades, and mysteriously made him a part of this institution, part of its wild and loathsome life. Silence became oppressive. "Why aren't you drinking?" he asked. She shivered. "What?" "You haven't finished your glass, Liuba. Why don't you?" "I don't want to by myself." "I'm sorry, but I don't drink." "And I don't drink by myself." "I would rather eat a pear." "Pray do so. They are here for that purpose." "Wouldn't you like a pear?" The girl did not answer, but turned aside and caught his glance resting on her naked and translucently rosy shoulders, and flung a grey knitted shawl over them. "It's rather cold," she said abruptly. "Yes, a little cold," he agreed, although it was very warm in that little room. And again there was a long and tense silence. From the hall could be heard the catchy rhythm of a noisy ritornello. "They are dancing," he said. "They are dancing," she replied. What was it made you so angry with me that you struck me, Liuba?« The girl hesitated and then answered sharply. »There was nothing else for it, so I struck you. I didn't kill you, so why make a fuss about it?« Her smile was ugly. There was nothing else for it? She was looking straight at him with her dark rounded eyes, with a pallid and determined smile. Nothing else for it? He noticed a little dimple in her chin. It was hard to believe that this same head, this evil, pallid head, had been lying on his shoulder a minute or two ago, that he had been caressing her. »So that's the reason,« he said gloomily. He paced to and fro in the room once or twice, but not toward the girl. And when he sat down again in the same place his face wore a strangely sullen and rather haughty expression. He said nothing, but, raising his eyebrows, stared at the ceiling where they played a spot of light with red edges. Something was crawling across it, something small and black, probably a belated autumn fly, revived by the heat. It had been brought to life in the night, and certainly understood nothing and would soon die. He sighed. But now she laughed aloud. »What is there to make you merry?« He looked up coldly and turned aside. »I suppose you are very much like the author. You don't mind? He too at first pities me, and then gets angry because I do not adore him as though he were an icon. He's so touchy. If he were God, he'd never forgive even one candle.« She smiled. »But how do you know any authors? You don't read anything.« »There is one,« she said curtly. He pondered, fixing on the girl his unswerving gaze, too calm in its scrutiny. Living in a turmoil himself, he began vaguely to recognize in the girl a rebellious spirit, and this agitated him and made him try to puzzle out why it was that her wrath had fallen on him. The fact that she had dealings with authors, and probably talked with them, that she could sometimes assume such an air of quiet dignity and yet could speak with such malice, all this gave her interest and endowed her blow with the character of something more earnest and serious than the mere hysterical outburst of a half-drunk, half-naked prostitute. At first he had been only indignant, not offended. But now, in this interval of reflection, he was gradually becoming affronted, and this, not only intellectually. »Why did you hit me, Liuba? When you strike anyone in the face, you should tell them why.« He repeated his question sullenly and persistently. Obstinacy and stony hardness were expressed in his prominent cheekbones and the heavy brow that overshadowed his eyes. »I don't know,« she replied with the same obduracy, but avoiding his gaze.